Good evening, Mr. Bond fans, and welcome once again, and especially thank you to those of you who have been intrepid enough to follow me through this journey through the entirety of the literary James Bond adventures. At this point, we have covered all of the Ian Fleming works, as well as 2 continuation novels and a couple of novelizations, but now I'm very excited, and maybe even a little apprehensive, to be at the start of another Bond author's series of James Bond adventures. I'm looking forward to this because I'm looking forward to seeing how another author takes that character and runs with him over a series of adventures, rather than just a 1 or 2 off like the previous post-Fleming authors have had. From 1981 to 1996, John Gardner will release 14 James Bond books and 2 film novelizations at pretty much a rate of 1 a year, which is quite something. John Gardner took on the job after Guild Rose Publications approached him to resurrect the literary 007. He had a military history and had overcome alcohol addiction himself, so he seemed like the natural fit to follow on from Fleming, I suppose. He'd published plenty of works before taking on Bond, mostly spy stories and thrillers, so again, seems like a natural fit, right? But at this point in time, the film series was an established thing, and possibly more well-known than the literary works, so I'll be very curious to see if that will be an influencing factor in Gardner's writing as well as the original Ian Fleming works. Well, we'll see, I guess, as we embark on a journey through John Gardner's Bond novels, beginning with the appropriately titled License Renewed. So let's start by talking about the plot, shall we? The book's first chapter is super short, and it's just intended as a little intriguing tease. We see a man in an airport bathroom applying a disguise and getting on a flight, and there's no context for anything that we're reading about, and even though it's only 3 pages, as an opening grabber, I don't think it works quite as well as perhaps some of the grabbers from, like, the Fleming era, for example. I'm going to be making a lot of comparisons to Fleming during this Gardner run-through, so just bear with me. But never mind that, because on to Chapter 2, and James Bond is back! Hip hip hooray! And he's driving his Saab to a cottage for the weekend? Which doesn't sound like the most in character of things for James Bond to be doing right off the bat, but, so much about Chapter 2 of this book sets off alarm bells about how this new author is handling James Bond. Firstly, the Saab. Bond is driving a Saab 900 Turbo, and no offense to anyone out there who owns a Saab, but my granddad had a Saab back in the mid-90s, and it's always going to be an old man's car to me, so here just having Bond driving it to his cottage, and then we're reading about him, like, putting on his slacks and his sandals and looking forward to spending a quiet weekend at the cottage, and I'm like, who is this man? He's even pissed off when he's, like, starting to get all settled down, and then his work phone rings, and he's like, oh, bloody world needs saving again. So relaxing weekend cancelled, Bond has to head back to MI6 for a briefing with M and Bill Tanner. And it's in these early pages that we learn that the 00 section has in fact been abolished. But Bond is still 007 and he's the only 00 in operation. He's kind of treated as a bit of a special case. By the way, we're very much in the 1980s here, much like how the film series has a shifting timeline that is translated over to the books at this point as well, I guess. This is still supposed to be Fleming's Bond and a continuation of the character we left off in The Man with the Golden Gun, but he seems a little older now and he's got some grey in his hair, but I don't think we're supposed to believe that he has aged in real time since The Man with the Golden Gun. He's a little bit older, but in real world in the terms of reality, he's not aged between the publications of the books, if that makes any sense. So, the mission for this one. Bond is told he needs to investigate a nuclear physicist named Anton Murik, because the guy has been seen meeting with an international terrorist named Franco, who was the guy in the airport in the first chapter, disguising himself. M and the head of MI5 suspect something nefarious is afoot, because these 2 guys have been meeting up, so Bond is sent off. Before that, though, we meet a new character Gardner has chosen to introduce, a very nice young lady who works in Q Branch named Anne Riley, who Bond nicknames Cute. If you're cringing about that name right now, then don't worry, I had the same reaction when I first read it. I cringed so much I think my buttocks folded in on themselves. Anyway, Cute is very much the one giving Bond his equipment, and Major Boothroyd is still here, but he's very much an armourer, and much like Fleming, the gadgets are somewhat toned down from what we would expect in the films, but still there is some fantastical stuff in here all the same. One of the weirder details is that Bond has his Saab tricked out at his own expense with gadgets and the like, rather than it going through Q Branch. There's even a mention somewhere of like, Major Boothroyd is actually a little bit interested to have a closer look at Bond's car, but Bond won't let Q Branch go anywhere near it. After being equipped, Bond goes back to Cute's place, and oh god, I just hate calling this character Cute. If I call her Anne Riley, it's because I cringe so much at just the very saying of the word cute. So, because it's the 80s, and I guess Gardner wants to show us how far things have progressed socially, Anne is almost aggressively pursuing Bond for sex, and they go back to her place, and none of this stuff is really necessary, I don't think, other than just to kind of prove a point about how sexually liberated women can be now in the 80s, and I think there might be something interesting in here about Bond having a sexual relationship with a colleague, and perhaps that will be explored somewhere else down the line, but it really isn't developed any further in this particular book. So on with the story, Bond is told to intercept Anton Murick, who is also mega rich, as well as being a nuclear physicist, by the way, at Ascot. Murick is there with his wife, Mary Jane, and his ward, Lavender Peacock. So obviously at this early point you know that one of these two ladies is going to be the Bond girl, and obviously it's the younger one, Lavender. I can't even believe that I was kind of like musing about like, oh well, maybe Bond's going to get with this married woman. No, it's the young one, obviously. They're just kind of attractive women, but Murick himself is described quite vividly. He's short and has a big mane of white hair. I just get this kind of troll-like image in my mind, which I think is quite cool, actually. Murick and co are in a VIP area, of course, and Bond wonders how he's going to be able to make contact with these people, so he steals Lavender's pearl necklace, and then he turns up with it at the booth saying that he found it, and rather than just saying, okay, thanks, bye, Murick invites Bond into his area, and within like 3 pages, he's invited Bond to his Scottish castle to talk a bit more about a job that he thinks Bond would be suitable for. At least Gardner is keeping alive that bizarre Fleming tradition of Bond villains strangely wanting to hire Bond to be a part of their personal staff. So Bond heads up to the castle in Scotland, where Murick is the Laird of Macaldy. By the way, I had absolutely no idea what a laird was until I looked it up for this review. It's someone who owns a large amount of land in Scotland, and when Bond gets to the castle, he gets involved in some Highland games, and Mary Jane is like running into Bond's room to try and seduce him, and I'm having flashbacks to 60s Casino Royale when this stuff is going on. Obviously in Casino Royale it's intended for laughs. Here I don't think it is, which is tough because I'm having a hard time taking this seriously, but as a result of defeating Murick's henchman Caber in the Highland Games knockoff, Murick decides to hire Bond as an assassin in order to kill the terrorist Franco, who Murick has been indeed conspiring with. Things get a little bit complicated here because Murick kind of has like 2 things going on. Because his brilliant nuclear physicist work was ignored, he plans on hijacking 6 nuclear power plants around the world and holding countries to ransom, lest he set them off into nuclear meltdown. He needed Franco to provide the terrorists for the on-foot work, like the actual hijacking of the plants, and while Murick says he has absolutely no intention of going through with it and causing a nuclear meltdown, he's pretty sure his demands will be met. Bond is very much aware that anything could happen with these terrorists, and even if one of these nuclear power plants went off because of a failed line of communication or anything like that, it would obviously be a worldwide disaster. Anyway, in order to sever any traces of his involvement in this scheme, Murick wants Bond to kill Franco, as Franco is the only link between Murick and the terrorists. But before that, Murick has asked Franco to kill Lavender Peacock at a fashion show in Paris, because it turns out that Lavender is actually the true heir to the estate that Murick is the laird of in Scotland, and this aspect of the plot is really not very Bondian. It feels quite Sunday night TV drama for me, like something you'd find in something like Downton Abbey. Bond kills Franco, and in the process of their fight, Mary Jane is actually killed instead of Lavender, and the big climax of the story takes place on Murick's plane, which is sort of like a control hub for all of the various terrorists that have broken into the power plants. From just kind of like a story perspective, it feels quite odd that all of the nuclear hijacking happens elsewhere. I was kind of sure that things were leading up to Bond eventually getting to one of these power plants and like thwarting it from there, but no, none of that happens. It all just kind of happens in Murick's plane. There's a pretty good fight with Caber on the plane, and the terrorists are eventually called off, but Murick actually escapes from the plane, which is pretty hilarious, and he ends up going back to his castle to like destroy the evidence that Lavender is actually the heir to the estate or something, but he's killed by Bond, who infiltrates with Bill Tanner, which I thought was pretty cool, like having both of those guys go off into the action together. And then the book ends with Bond swanning off with Lavender, but as she becomes more and more involved with the running of her land and her estate stuff and all that kind of stuff, the pair kind of part amicably and go on with their different lives. While this is a continuation of the literary Bond, it's clear to see how much of the cinematic Bond has influenced the structure and the plot here. The thing is paced like a movie, and there are little bits of action at necessary moments, plot reveals and stuff all kind of take place in such a way that almost feels like you're just reading through a detailed outline for a film. This is in contrast to a good few of the Fleming books, which would be impossible to faithfully translate to the big screen. You Only Live Twice, for example, like if you were to faithfully adapt that story and not change anything and just put it on the screen, like literally half the movie would be Bond sat around talking to people, and then it would like shift into being like a horror movie for 20 minutes before a final bit of action. And I'm not saying that the Gardner approach is wrong, but I was finding all the story beats quite predictable as a result of this pacing. Something else that I think Gardner kind of faults on is the setting and the locations. Like, Fleming would often go off on these long tangents about a place and things, and for the most part, these worked really well to make you feel the location. I almost always had a great sense of geography about a place where I'd never been to in real life, which is saying something. His descriptions were undeniably incredibly rich. With Gardner, things feel a little bit like, I guess, lacking in personality. I don't feel as whisked away with Gardner as I did with Fleming. But Lord, does Gardner enjoy describing his tech stuff. I mean, it all comes across a little bit Alan Partridge-y, especially in all of the Q Branch stuff with Anne Riley, and because he's describing a lot of 80s tech and 80s stuff, and it just doesn't have that kind of like timeless, kind of romantic quality that I think a lot of the stuff from the 50s and 60s does. It's just kind of less exotic, even if it is more, more advanced. So let's talk about Bond. He is supposed to be Fleming's Bond, but there are a few updates. Even though this does not work on a linear timeline necessarily, Bond is still a little bit older than when we left him with Fleming, so he has some grey strands in his hair. He's also drinking less and smoking lighter cigarettes. From a personality perspective, he's wittier and certainly more talkative than Fleming's Bond ever was, and I suppose that, again, that's probably more of the influence of the movie series seeping into the work. At his essence, he is still the same guy, I suppose, but I just can't get over the cottage and the Saab. I mean, things improve as the book goes on, of course. I'm getting really hung up on that on that second chapter, the one that introduced Bond, but there's less stuff after that kind of causes my eyes to drop out of their sockets, but I'm like, who is this man who just wants a cozy weekend away in his cottage? Of the supporting characters, I suppose Anton Muric makes the biggest impression, and I don't know if that's just because I think he's very well described and I have a very clear image in my head of what this guy looks like and who this guy is. And saying that, his plan is really not good. His villainous scheme is severely flawed, and when Bond points out these flaws, we're just to buy that Muric is just so crazy that he doesn't, care about any of these discrepancies. He just kind of lets things slide as a result. He's a perfectly serviceable, very cartoony Bond villain. I could have just done without that whole inheritance subplot thing. Then next to him, there's Lavender Peacock, the main Bond girl of the book, and with her it's easy to see that Gardner has perfectly emulated the Fleming quality of poorly written female characters. She is just so bland, and as of doing this review, I finished the book a while back before writing this, and I really can't remember or describe any discernible personality qualities this character has. I feel like M is a touch softer than he was in the Flemings, maybe because it's made clear from the start of the film that he made a special exception in keeping Bond on as 007, so from that alone he must have a lot of value in the guy. M and the MI6 presence is certainly more active throughout the story than they have been before too, with the story jumping back to M every once in a while while to kind of comment on where Bond is at, and I suppose it works as a gauge of how Bond's actions are affecting the wider intelligence community. Now, I'm not suggesting that any elements from this story were consciously influencing the Bond film series, but there are a couple of connections that I thought would be kind of interesting to point out. First and foremost, Bond heading to Ascot to meet with a villain is very A View to a Kill, and the whole plot involving nuclear power is very The World's Not Enough, and this book isn't credited as an influence on those stories. I'd be very surprised if that was the case, but I think it's still interesting nonetheless to kind of point out these similarities with the future films of the series as and when they come up. Overall, while I'm not expecting any post-Fleming Bond to come close to the quality of that original author's work, I had a fairly enjoyable time reading License Renewed. It's a very straight-down-the-barrel Bond story, with the exception of a couple of strange plot flourishes here and there. Everything is kind of just as to be expected, really. At best, it's okay. At worst, it's bland and silly. Its highs aren't that high and its lows aren't that low. I'm more eager to see where Gardner goes from this point. Maybe this book was just intended to kind of set a bar. To wear in the new shoes that Gardner is now the owner of. And from this base, he can kind of jut off into more interesting and exciting places, or at least that's my hope. So as always, Bond fans, please do let me know your thoughts in the comment section below, particularly if you have read this book, because I don't actually know that many people who have read the post-Fleming continuation novels, and I'm going to be curious to find as many opinions on these as possible, so please do comment below if you have in fact read this book, and tell me what your opinion on it was. Also below are the links to my various social medias, my Facebook and my Twitter, and please, if you haven't already, do subscribe to this channel. That would help me a great deal. And until next time, Bond fans, so long for now.